HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Portrait of an Unknown Lady by Maria Gainza. Read by Kyla García. Herself. There I was, finally, at the Hotel Étoile. It said no vacancies on the door, but I went in anyway and asked for a room. They gave me one on the 10th floor. View of the cemetery, Italian marble bath, Louis XVI writing desk, raft-sized bed, the pillows of which were encrusted with little bonbons in burnished wrappers, like rhinestones in the snow. I told the concierge my husband was going to be along later with the luggage, but my husband wasn't ever going to be along. I'm not a person to lie to someone's face, but in this instance it was out of my hands. I checked in under the made-up name of Mariette Lydis. Nobody asked for any papers. Had they done so, they might perhaps have recognized the art critic I once was. But with the collar of my mangy black fur coat up around my ears, who was going to pick out the somebody I'd been in the art world, even if it was a fairly prestigious somebody? A claim justified by the idea, however wishful, that a delicate prose style may signify honesty, that style and character are indivisible. I was going to confine myself to that imperial room, so called on the bronze panel over the walnut door, and give free rein to the inner hackette we all bear inside. The only way for me to turn the page, to start afresh, was to write down what I knew. My model being the 18th century practice among the English, as described in Defoe's Moll Flanders, of allowing the condemned to recount their crimes before being hauled off to the gallows. Any person reading this ought not to expect names, numbers, or dates. The stuff of my tale has slipped through my fingers. All that remains now is a little of the atmosphere. My techniques are those of the impressionist, and not even the neo kind. On top of which, my years in the art world have made me wary. I have only distrust for historians coercing the reader with the precision of facts. All those cold, crabbed notes at the foot of the page. It was so, they say. I am at the point where it is the nicer distinctions I appreciate, and I prefer for people to say, "Let us suppose it was so." I was born with a skewed smile. A weakness in my muscles means the left corner of my mouth never reaches quite so high as the loftier right. Duplicitousness, people say this is a sign of, an underhand nature, like the good man who turned thief because his shoulders when he walked evinced the languor of a cat. And when people say a thing, and then repeat it and repeat it, eventually one does come to believe it. If there's anything that could be said to define the way I am today, it's a general jitteriness. Very early in life, for reasons not to the point, I gave up any hopes I might have stored in either men or women. And in any case, those of my own sex have always been guarded in my presence. There has only ever been one woman who put her trust in me, which made me feel valued. And to people who do that, one owes everything. We first met in the offices of Ciudad Bank, in the Fine Art Valuations Department. Enriqueta began working there in the 1960s as a cum laude graduate of the Argentinian Fine Arts Academy. I had gotten a job through friends of the family, which in my time was the way jobs were got. At a Christmas get-together a couple of years ago, my Uncle Richard stood up and in a booming, drunken slur announced that what our very own black sheep needed was a job, that it was the only way to whip her into shape. My uncle's intelligence and clichés have always been a good match. A start in the world was the last thing on my mind. In fact, my personal credo consisted of a firm commitment to drifting along, to avoiding ties with anyone or anything. In the family, however, I was deemed a lost cause, and the best I could hope for was to excel as a catcher of butterflies. I don't know why exactly, but for some reason I decided to accept the challenge. Probably to shut Uncle Richard up. So it was that a drunken conversation led to me starting work as the personal slave of Enriqueta Macedo. It was 9 o'clock in the morning on the first Monday in January when I opened the glass door at Ciudad Bank and approached the female receptionist sitting on the far side of a glass counter. She wore no bra, for all that that particular battle had long since been won, and when I said Señorita Macedo was expecting me, her raised eyebrows suggested that a mauling was not beyond the realms of possibility. She directed me to another glass door. The prevalence of that material stood out to me, an attempt perhaps to give the impression of transparency in the dealings of the institution it housed. There was no need to ask whether she was she. Enriqueta Macedo was the country's preeminent expert in art authentication, a true great of the art world, and when I went in, I found her crouching close up to a painting on the wall, about to dive into it. She didn't so much appear to be looking at it as to be taking in its scent. I cleared my throat timidly, like people in the movies. She got to her feet, surprisingly supple for a woman her age, and raised her chin to beckon me. This haughty gesture, I later realized, was a way of lifting her sagging neck skin. She wore a lemon-yellow blouse and a creased steel-gray trouser suit. On the outside, unremarkable, a touch preposterous even, but as I would later realize, it was an exterior to belie what lay within. I immediately did as instructed and went over. There was something of the hospital scanner in the way her eyes looked me up and down. Since I found it impossible to hold her gaze, I opted to look at my feet, just black blots on the floor. She spoke before I had a chance to think. "Well, I hope you've done your homework." I flickered one of my lopsided smiles at her, the asymmetry of which might have amused, pained, or come as a relief to her. Enriqueta gave a commiserative click of the tongue and led me over to her desk. "Don't mind my little games. Always looking for a fight. Seems I can't help it. Now," she said, indicating a pile of 20 or so black folders, "your first assignment. Family secrets." Like a frock coat worn to conceal a belly too big, the folders held the invoices for every painting deposited with the bank over the course of several months. I began looking through the seemingly endless paper trail, and when I grew weary of feigning interest, resigned myself to my fate. I would get used to it, I said. It's remarkable how quickly we can get used to anything. I was 25 and had landed a job in the most distinguished valuations department in the country, the single despotic authority on the price and authenticity of all paintings then being bought or sold across the land, and a kind of upmarket pawn shop and storage space provider anytime there was a legal dispute over an artwork. Despite any apparent mystique, from the inside it was a darkly governmental kind of place, soul-sapping in its grayness. A diffuse sensation of distress occasionally gripped me. All the talk was of profit margins, and the employees spoke a language I could only partially follow, as though just the single units of speech, never the overall import. In order to establish a place for myself in this money-worshipping family, I assumed a rather questionable attitude. I made my contempt for money clear. Only Enriqueta seemed to comprehend my moral asphyxia. The time that has now elapsed makes it difficult to do justice to her, but let us say that in her I found all the flair and grace otherwise so seemingly lacking in this new environment. She was the kind of woman whom old age suited. At last, she must have thought. In winter she wore a black fur coat that had something of the mangy dog about it. It was far from fetching, but it kept the cold off, and that was all she cared about. You would see her arrive at the office, an air of divine severity about her, perhaps the product of so many years spent in close quarters with works of art. "These paintings are like the mountains," I remember her saying once as she looked around her. "They will outlive us all." Enriqueta was clear-eyed when it came to people, but her faith in art bordered on the esoteric. She rarely spoke of it, but then she was of a generation that had less need to verbalize absolutely everything. Her work hours were spent in a no-frills office, the furniture upholstered in real leather, and framed reproductions of William Blake prints on the walls. On that first day, seeing me eyeing them, she invited me to take a closer look. "But careful," she said. "They bite. Or they could, if they wanted to. They're all I believe in. They were from Blake's Paradise Lost. The scenes of hell struck me as far superior to those set in heaven, though I did not say so. I was yet to learn what it meant to have an opinion of one's own. The day would come when it would cost me to think for myself. There was an air of mystery in Enriqueta's office. It would have been little surprise to see one of the book-lined walls swing open to reveal a hidden corridor. She sat at her desk, head poking out from behind catalogs piled up around her like a wagon circle. Her origins were always unclear. She never mentioned her family, save to recall a great-grandfather who was among those depicted in the raft of the Medusa, and who suffered the fate of being eaten by the other castaways. Apart from this honorable genealogical detail, she moved through life as if alone. She was cold and severe, and in the eyes of people in the office, the normal sort of people one finds in offices, pompous, too. Yet I took to her in an instant. And not only because working under her was a training for the mind, but because something told me she was more than a mere upper-class monster. A rare soul, you might say, one of the initiated, and possessed of the raptor's eye, a thing like gold dust in that milieu, and increasingly so like a clinical eye in the world of medicine. She could look through a picture, see its whole matrix. She had an innate skill for deconstructing an image in her mind and putting it back together again, as a Swiss watchmaker would a clock. Also an avowed Luddite, she rejected out of hand any technological advance claiming to assist in the work of authentication. The only thing she permitted was a flashlight small enough to fit in the palm of one's hand that emitted a bluish glow barely visible to the naked eye. The black light, as it is known in forensic science, used at crime scenes to detect traces of blood, semen, saliva, or sweat. What art authenticators are looking for with it are the final additions to any work. According to Enriqueta, this little device was all one needed to delve into a painting's core. Nothing else was worth the trouble. How long would it take a woman like Enriqueta to see through me? A month? A week? Perhaps a few minutes would do it. But to my great surprise, it seemed she saw something in me. She immediately decided to take me under her wing, and before I had realized it, chose me as her successor. "Mark my words," she said a few days in. "Never let your emotions show while you are between these four walls. Keep your cards close to your chest, and they'll leave you be." Wanting to make me more unflappable, she told me the story of Anaxagoras, the pre-Socratic who, on learning of the death of his son, replied, "Siebam me genius mortalum." I knew I had begot a mortal. And yet I am sure her serenity, which she hoisted like a flag of philosophy, wasn't her natural disposition. It was her method, I believe, of keeping the world at bay. My first months were a crash course in all that goes into the valuation of a work of art. I was young, I knew little, and the little I knew I didn't understand. But at the same time, I was liable to be interested, voraciously interested in just about anything. I hung on Enriqueta's every word, and in a hardcover Rivadavia notebook, wrote down the pearls she dropped along the way. Headings such as establishing pedigree, origin, authenticity, differentiating old canvas from tea-stained paper, minor details, ears, fingernails, Giovanni Morelli technique. It was rare that Enriqueta came out with anything that was not both as pointed and as pleasingly formed as a hedgehog. She often spoke in aphorisms and made no distinction between those borrowed and those she herself made up. A conversation about a painting is the quickest way to get to know a person. Or, it is best to be bursting for the toilet when viewing a painting. A sphincter on the edge makes for an alert mind. Or, art is the greatest way to find out what people are truly like. It is the cheapest lie detector I know of. She needed no prompting to come out with such things. On Fridays, always the quietest day of the week, she sent me to the library for old auction catalogs, and I was then to spend the day poring over them. "This is a muscle," she said, "and it needs building up, like any other." I looked without knowing what I was supposed to be looking at. When in desperation I pointed this out, she said, "A moment comes when you just know. You feel it or sense it, what a piece is supposed to look like." Her talk about paintings often seemed to teeter into advice on the art of living. Another thing about her, there was an acuteness, an aliveness in everything that she did. To me, whether I was helping her with the crossword, removing the bones from the fish she was about to eat, right up to tying her shoelaces when her arthritis was bad, all was pure poetry. Come 6 p.m., when most of the staff disappeared, the two of us would go up to the rooftop terrace to continue the conversation. I had the best seat in the house for these twilit disquisitions of hers. She could hold forth for hours on Vasari, Karl von Mander, Pico della Mirandola, though always eschewing the leaden solemnity of the Academy. Eyes closed, she spoke of these artists as lifelong intimates, referring to them by nicknames of her own devising, or upbraiding them for their lack of hygiene. It seemed to me like she forgot, for whole moments at a time, where she was and with whom. But there were days, if the sky was clear as the sun went down, when a rare combination of solar radiation, smog, and the neon signs bathed the cityscape in a light the color of roasted apples, like something out of a painting by the pre-Raphaelite Edward Burne-Jones. I am talking of an optical effect, lasting no more than 5 minutes, but which would, the moment it began, see Enriqueta leap out of her lounge chair like bread from a toaster, look to the sky, and pursing her lips, murmur, "Flamantia moenia mundi," at which the coppery light striking her chest and pouring down over her shoulders, a prolonged shiver ran through my body. Suddenly I saw her for what she was, an artist who had never produced a work of art in her own right. I very soon made it clear that I was at her disposal for whatever she should need, whether it be making coffee or carrying out an act of cold-blooded murder. She should do with me as she pleased. Enriqueta read me like a book. I had been at Ciudad Bank for a year when I got up one Sunday morning to an answering machine message saying I was to meet her at 5 p.m. on the corner of Suipacha and Sarmiento and to bring my swimsuit. Like the good soldier I was, I readied my kit and, approaching the appointed address, was reminded of the line about a person's character being formed on Sunday afternoons. She was there when I arrived, standing in the doorway smoking one of her gouloirs, always smoked to the final millimeter, always dropped to the ground and crushed under her French heels. She gestured for me to follow her. Such intimacy in that gesture. "Commit a crime and the world turns to glass," she murmured, eyes flicking left and right as we entered the Colmeña baths. The people working there, with their flushed faces, peremptory manner, and white uniforms, greeted her like a lifelong acquaintance. In the airless changing rooms, I put on my swimsuit, the lycra baggy, and made my way out to a pool around which firm-bodied sirens and sea gods had once frolicked, but that now stood in a state of semi-abandonment, the tiling loose underfoot. A cluster of elderly men and women, skin sagging, sat on the edges dangling their feet, harboring loneliness and fears. Enriqueta appeared a few minutes later, looking unexpectedly stylish in her black swimsuit, and gliding down the metal ladder, moving as fluidly as a signature's flourish to join me in the tepid water. We silently swam some breaststroke. Another truth: strong winds will keep you away from those of your own species, but water joins you together. We got out, wrapped ourselves in the rough white towels, and like Carthusian monks went down a passageway sticky underfoot with grime. We came to a small wood-paneled room, the steps and platforms wooden as well, a hint of rosemary on the searing air. We sat down facing each other, and then, seeing as nobody came in, turned over onto our backs. It was a good place for not saying anything. Outside the sauna, the elderly group had begun to make their way around the edge of the pool, and the high-pitched creaking of their walking sticks and Zimmer frames could be heard, a strange sound, as though those contraptions were made of ice. I started to feel like my head had a wool blanket wrapped around it, and soon fell into something of a daze. "Now, if you don't mind," said Enriqueta, jolting me out of my stupor, "I am going to tell you one or two things. Things I want you to know." The anecdote about Garibaldi on his departure from Rome came to mind, saying to his men he could promise thirst and heat by day, cold and hunger by night, and great danger at all hours. The usual hoarse concision of her speech was gone. Her voice grew distant, as though she were addressing me from horseback, or from high on a mountain, and in a language that in other circumstances I would have defined as biblical. I can make little claim for fidelity in my tale, given how my relaxed muscles conspired against my ability to concentrate, but at the same time, I know very well the crux of what was said. For a span of 40 years, Enriqueta Macedo, upright and beyond reproach, had been giving certificates of authenticity to forged works of art. She earned a commission from each spurious piece that she authenticated, but money was not what drove her. Rather, she said, she wanted to raise the bar for art in general. The true measure of a painting, she said, was how good it was, not the accuracy of the signature in the corner. "Can a forgery not give as much pleasure as an original? Isn't there a point when fakes become more authentic than originals? And anyway," she added, "isn't the real scandal the market itself?" All of this she fired at me point blank with no expectation of any reply. She was Enriqueta Macedo, the herself of the valuations department. How on earth could I be expected to find fault with her arguments? That first conversation lasted no more than 20 minutes, the recognized period of time after which it becomes very tedious to stay in a sauna. But we found our way back there again on several occasions. It quickly became clear to me why kingpins in the criminal underworld choose to run their private affairs in such places. Even the most committed informer, reduced to a swimsuit, can't wear a wire. Oh, sauna! Oh, great leveler! With bellies on display, there is nothing to tell the millionaire from the beggar, the low-down criminal from the most distinguished of citizens. From then on, important matters were always discussed in that small, hot cubicle. There were times when the billowing steam grew especially thick, and the figure of Enriqueta apparently vanishing. I felt that I was actually alone, and that the voice I could hear was coming from inside me. Simply put, this was my entry into the world of crime. I finally felt part of something, and the two facets of myself felt met. The one that yearned for protection, and the other always in need of adventure. Naturally, fear got the better of me at times, and I hadn't yet found my way to the right philosophers in order to know that all strong sensations bring with them a certain amount of terror. It soon became clear that she and I were identical souls disguised under different identities. Unser Reiner, Enriqueta said we were, quoting the great Bernard Berenson. At root, we were two romantics, rebels to the bourgeoisie and to that whole way of seeing the world, the buying way. With Enriqueta, my life was no longer bland and flavorless. We would spend evenings at her apartment on Pasaje del Carmen eating scrambled eggs, the secret to which, she showed me, was enormous quantities of butter, and watching Orson Welles' F for Fake, a documentary film that is to the world of art forgery as The Godfather is to the mafia. Elmire de Hori, the most notorious forger of the 20th century, was our very own Vito Corleone, the first person to transform the criminal experience into something complex, noble, and heroic. It never failed to leave us rapt, with some new detail emerging for discussion with every viewing. It was also always the same scenes that made Enriqueta laugh, a sound like vast amounts of coal rumbling down a chute. It was a sound from another world, and diabolically contagious. The forgers we used had little in common with de Hori. They tended to lead obscure lives, often as graduates of the Fine Arts Academy who'd failed to break into the art scene, and worked other jobs by day. There was Crossato, plumber and specialist in butler, Chacarita with his job in his family's car workshop, and his unerring quinquelas, Suarez, who was in fact a successful artist, but one who, out of a natural transgressive bent, painted machios that were, in his words, better than the real thing, and who had the whole Harta family on the production line, and Mildred, a former hostess at the Dragón Rojo, legendary for having forged the Magritte held in the Clem collection. All were good, said Enriqueta, consummate, even, but none had what she once saw in a forger called René, the disconcerting ability to enter the soul of another. It was the first time I heard the name. We would meet the forger in Las Delicias, a bar on the corner of Callao and Quintana, at a table at the back on the right. We would be accompanied by Lazinski, the Russian who acted as intermediary, but who said next to nothing, intent instead on doodling on a paper napkin for the entirety of each meeting. He and Enriqueta acted like old friends, though the past was never explicitly mentioned. There would be gin and tonics, there would be bar snacks, and once the niceties were out of the way, Enriqueta would place the envelope containing the certificate of authenticity on the table, swiftly met by one from the forger containing the money. These were slid in opposite directions, like passing cars. Then it would be into the ladies to count the money. Enriqueta's practice was to make 2 rolls of a similar size, undo the top button of her blouse, and insert each into her bra. And every time, without fail, doing her button-up and checking her appearance in the mirror, with breasts newly bolstered, she would blow on the tip of her forefinger, like the smoking barrel of a gun. I felt great kinship with Enriqueta, but at the same time began to wonder, was it in fact with her, or with my own way of thinking? Enriqueta expressed all that I admired, with the difference that she also embodied it. Nobody in the office knew but us. These things are done either discreetly, Enriqueta would say, or not at all. Though really my part was a minor one. It was a delectatio morosa sort of thing, me as sidekick, or voyeur, if one prefers. So if it was raining, let us say, it would fall to me to hold the umbrella above her head all the way to whichever assignation we were bound for, and when the rain stopped, carefully close it, shake the raindrops off, and hook it over my forearm for the rest of the way. The substance of our activities, the Rolodex and the phone calls themselves, were her domain. There were occasions when we would come out of a meeting and I would catch her observing me, trying to establish the thickness of my skin, I think. But for all our shady dealings, there was never any point at which I felt shocked. It was not that Enriqueta set me on the path to corruption, more that she revealed how far along it I had already gone. There would also be weeks when no forgeries came in, and that saw the 2 of us at odds with the world, and me submerged in the endless barrenness of paperwork. But eventually a piece would arrive, and it was like the blood returning to our veins. It has a certain je ne sais quoi, Enriqueta would say, rubbing her hands together like a squirrel on the way to make mischief. A pleasure that's hard to describe, no? Wars have been started, and homes broken, and careers ended just for this very feeling. The 2 of us were due to spend a weekend at the Gualeguaychú hot springs, when on the Wednesday before, Enriqueta did not turn up at work. She had not missed a day in years, and Uncle Richard suggested I walk over to her apartment during lunchtime. I knew I would be able to get in, given my knowledge of the coin trick, a secret I unfortunately cannot divulge here. Going into the bathroom, I found her lying on her back on the white marble floor. The tap in the sink was running. She was wearing her yellow blouse and gray skirt, and compression stockings covered her sturdy lower legs. I was granted a view of her hairline, far back on the forehead, like a disobedient glacier gone drifting far, far upstream. But this minor irregularity aside, nothing looked out of the ordinary. There was neither blood nor the smell of rotting flesh, nothing dramatic. She had gone into the bathroom, it looked like, to get a glass of water. She was hardly the picture of health, having suffered from esophagitis for 40 or so years, relied on only the 1 kidney for about 30, and coped with rheumatoid arthritis for the last 3. Whatever had killed her, it had been quick. Something tells me she would not have known the end was coming. Her birthday was the following week.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?